All right, welcome back to WMMA Now with your host Chuck Stevenson. And tonight I wanted to talk about, I wanted to do a overall review and assessment of the ONE Atomweight Grand Prix. Now this Grand Prix wrapped up in December, and it is now January 31st as I recorded this. And I wanted to wait a little bit and give the whole Grand Prix situation, time to marinate, time to really sink in, and before I did like a full reflection on it. But so now I've done that, I want to do this video. Now, this is basically going to be two main segments. I'm going to do a timeline of the Grand Prix from the time it was announced all the way up to the end, and that includes reviewing, doing a little bit of a mini review of each fight, and then at the end of the timeline, once I get done, going to talk about the pros and the cons of this Grand Prix, because there were plenty of both. But we'll get to those in a second. But when this Grand Prix was announced, I was really excited. I think a lot of people were. And then we had to wait a little bit to see who was announced. And then when they announced all the fighters that were in it, I think it just blew a lot of people's minds away. Just heads were blown who all was in it, because they got some really good fighters, and they brought in one of the most international mixed martial arts tournaments I've seen in years, especially as regards to the ladies. For women's Grand Prix, MMA Grand Prix, it was definitely probably one of the most international tournaments ever. And I think overall it turned out good, but again, we'll get to that in the pros and cons. So back on around October 3rd of 2020, ONE Championship decided to announce a women's Grand Prix, or Atomweight Grand Prix, at their 115-pound atomweight class. Now, this was on the heels of the ONE Atomweight Champion, Angela Lee, announcing her pregnancy. At the time, Lee had already been inactive for 1 year. Granted, the pandemic and everything got in the way. But then after that started to calm down and ONE started to put on events again, Lee came out with the news that she was pregnant. And ONE Championship knew, well, we've got to do something with this division. Our champion's already sat out for a year, and she's going to be out for another, 8-9 months. And we got to do something to keep this division, active, keep these fighters active. And we've got to do something. Basically, we've got to do something to distract from the fact that our champion has already been inactive 1 year and will be inactive again for most of another year. So they decided to announce this Grand Prix. Now, it wasn't until February that they finally announced the 8 participants. So we had to wait November, December, January, February, 4 months we had to wait before they finally announced all the participants. And it is the 8 fighters that you see here. We had Mungbo, Sahi Ham, Stamp Fairtex, Aliona Rasohina, Elise Anderson, Itsuki Hirata, Ritu Fogat, and Denise Zamboanga. So you had China, South Korea, Thailand, Ukraine, USA, Japan, India, and the Philippines represented. Like I said, this was an international roster with a good mix of homegrown ONE Championship fighters and fighters from outside of ONE who, had made their names, made their bones outside of ONE. So then the next month in March, they announced the quarterfinal matchups. And we had Zamboanga facing Ham, and Rasohina facing Stamp, Hirata facing Anderson, and Mungbo taking on Ritu Fogat. And this was all going to take place in May. The planned start date was May at ONE Championship Empower, ONE Championship's first ever all-ladies event. So first we had the event got postponed in May. So the event was supposed to be for, I believe, what was it, May 21st, and then we had some delays. So first up, we had some problems. Ritu Fogat fought one more time at one dangle and got eliminated, which already made a change in the roster. And then the event itself got postponed all the way back to September. So we had one championship and power was set for September 3rd. Then Ritu Fogat managed to get her way back into the tournament, after picking up a win. So she lost, was out of the tournament, and then picked up a win and immediately got put back into the Grand Prix. Because basically in an interview, Chatri Sityodtong, the ONE CEO, said, there's no way we weren't going to have her in because she represents a huge market that we're trying to break into, which I got to admit, I appreciated his candor there. He was not shy about admitting why they wanted her back in. So they scheduled ONE Championship and Power for September 3rd. And we had the alternate bout, Mei Yamaguchi taking on newcomer Julie Meza Barba, who at one time was supposed to be standing in for Ritu Fogat. She got pushed back to the alternate bout. Then in the quarterfinals, Hirata versus Anderson, Mumbo versus Fogat, Aliona Rasohina versus Stamp Fairtex, and Denise versus Ham. So the first bout was the alternate with Yamaguchi versus Meza Barba. And this fight, I'm still trying to assess because I've only seen Meza Barba fight once since then, and Yamaguchi hasn't fought at all since then. Meza Barba just basically shut out Yamaguchi. And she was definitely like the taller fighter in there, which she used to her advantage, and she largely stuck on the outside for striking. But with this fight, I got to admit, it was still hard to assess. Like, was Meza Barba that much better than Yamaguchi, or is Yamaguchi now in her late 30s over the hill? I guess I'm going to have to wait to see if Yamaguchi fights again before I can assess that if she's over the hill or not. But Julie Meza Barba ended up winning via decision. So she was now the official alternate for the Grand Prix. For the semifinals, should a quarterfinalist drop out. Then in the first of the quarterfinal bouts, Itsuki Hirata defeated Elise Anderson. Hirata largely controlled this fight with her takedowns and control on the ground. Now Anderson, not to say that she was completely shut out, because she wasn't. I mean, she gave Hirata her toughest fight yet. I believe it was the first time Hirata went to decision. And in the third round, Anderson hit Hirata with I believe a right hook that dropped Hirata, had her stumbling a little bit, but Hirata, showed some fortitude and was able to recover and control the rest of the round. So Hirata won via I believe unanimous decision, and was the first fighter to move on to the semifinals. Then in the second final bout, Mumbo versus Ritu Fogat. This was probably the most exciting of the quarterfinal bouts. Mumbo dropped Fogat in the first round, had her wobbled, and it seemed like she was en route to finishing. Had her on the ground, went for an armbar, which I thought was ill-advised, wasn't able to get it, and the bout went to the second round. Second round, Mumbo again was largely beating Ritu Fogat on the feet. Hurt her again, but then Ritu really took over with her wrestling in the second round. And in the third round, Ritu just absolutely controlled with her wrestling. So the judges gave it to Ritu Fogat, who was your second Grand Prix semifinalist. So then in the third quarterfinal, we had Aliona Rasohina and Stamp Fairtex. And this was a rematch from early in 2021. And, Rasohina won that one via last-second submission over Stamp. But this time, Stamp came back with a vengeance. And this was a good, really good back and forth battle. Possibly even, now that I think about it more, it possibly even a better fight than Fogat versus Mung Bo, because this fight was really back and forth. Each one of them was threatening with submissions. Each was getting good shots off on the feet. Went to the judges, and I believe this was the only split decision, with two of them seeing it for Stamp Fairtex. So Stamp was your third semifinalist to move on. Then in the final Grand Prix quarterfinal bout, Denise Zamboanga versus Sahi Ham. Absolutely, without a doubt, the most controversial fight of the entire Grand Prix. A lot of inactivity from both fighters. Ham doing her best on the outside when she can get on the outside to strike. Denise largely going for takedowns that just weren't successful, mostly holding Ham against the fence. She got Ham down, I believe, at once in the first or second, but was unable to keep her there for more than a couple seconds. Largely a stalemate fight. Now, in the third round, there was an accidental clash of heads that opened up a big cut and on Denise Zamboanga's head. And the referee stopped the bout, brought in the doctor. Doctor, they got the bleeding to stop. Judge able to continue. From the restart, Zamboanga blasted out of their corner for a double leg on Ham, took her down, and started to land some ground and pound on top before the bell ended. This one went to the judges, and it was a split decision for Sahi Ham. And there was so much controversy following this decision. My initial reaction was that it could have gone either way. Upon rewatch, I judged it in favor of Ham myself, but there was just an absolute crap storm online from Zamboanga's fans over this, that they ended up going to the ONE Championship Competition Committee. Zamboanga petitioned to the competition committee to review the fight. They ended up doing a review of this bout and decided to stick with the competition committee, stuck with the judge's decision in favor of Ham. So she was your fourth and final quarter finalist to move on to the semifinals. So then after ONE Empower was over, a week or so later, ONE Championship announced that they were going to do the judging, or excuse me, the semifinals were going to be decided by vote, by fan voting. So the fans voted in, and they voted Stamp versus Ham in a striker versus striker battle, and Ritu Fogat versus Itsuki Hirata in a grappler versus grappler bout. So either way, we were guaranteed to get a striker versus grappler bout in the finals. Unfortunately, there were some hiccups. So the semifinals were decided for ONE Next Gen on 29 October. Ham Sahi had to drop out, unfortunately, due to a fractured finger. So she was replaced in the semifinals by Julie Meza Barba, who faced off against Stamp. And then come fight week, Sunday of fight week, Itsuki Hirata came down ill and was unable to make it to the event. So she was pulled, and they pulled up the next alternate, Jenny Lynn Olson. Olson was supposed to face against Gian Radzuan at ONE Next Gen, and they pulled up Olson into the semifinals. So we went from having, 4 semifinalists to now having 2 original semifinalists taking on 2 alternates. So at ONE Next Gen on Friday, 29 October, there was actually multiple pullouts on this card, and the ladies ended up getting moved up to the main event and a co-main event. So the first semifinal bout, here we have them again here, Stamp versus Meza Barba and Fogat versus Olson. So in the first semifinal bout, Fogat versus Olson, this is a good fight. I thought Olson gave a really good account of herself for coming in on short notice, who had, wasn't even prepared to be in the tournament bracket, and was facing the strongest grappler left in the tournament against Fogat. Fogat again showed her toughness in this fight. Olson had her hurt, landed a knee to her in a stand-up, and for some reason, Olson just absolutely failed to capitalize on it. Had Fogat hurt, failed to capitalize on it. And Fogat, largely controlled this fight with her wrestling. But again, I got to give credit to Jenilyn Olson in that she was largely able to keep Fogat within her guard and keep, somewhat out of danger while on the ground. Didn't let Fogat, pass her guard. I think maybe once or twice, but not for very long. Olson did really good guard work here to, prevent Fogat from trying to get a finish on her. So I thought this was a really good bout, but the winner ended up being Ritu Fogat by decision. So she was the first fighter to move on to the finals. And in the second bout, this one was heating up in, the pre-fight. Julie Meza Barba was talking a lot of smack on Stamp, said that her Muay Thai was trash. She was going to outstrike her, yada, yada, this, that, and the third. The war of words was really heating up between these two, particularly from Meza Barba's side, because I think she was really trying to show that, hey, I may have been an alternate, but I belong here. Come fight time, Stamp honestly just outclassed her en route to a decision. Stamp was just better everywhere the fight went. Her striking was on point. Her Muay Thai, her low kicks particularly, she used really well in this fight, and even on the ground. Stamp just outclassed Meza Barba wherever this fight went. So Stamp was your second semifinalist to move on to the finals. So now we had your two finalists, and it was two homegrown ONE Championship fighters, Stamp taking on Ritu Fogat, and that was going to be on December 3rd for the finals at ONE Winter Warriors. So we had Stamp versus Ritu. And again, this was another one where these two started to talk a little bit smack for each other. Each one accused the other of being afraid of them. Both said they were going to finish the other. This was really building up to be an all-star final for this Grand Prix. And so they went in there, Stamp and Ritu, and it was a good first round. A little bit of back and forth action. Stamp largely controlling on the feet. Ritu trying to get the fight to the ground. Second round, the fight went to the ground, but it ended up being Stamp that showed off her improved ground game. The striker showed the grappler how it was done, getting the finish via armbar. The only finish of the tournament came from a world-class striker submitting a world-class wrestler via armbar in the second round. So we had your new champion, Stamp Fairtex, with that huge silver belt there. And it was a well-deserved win for Stamp, and it was a really good look for ONE Championship because, their homegrown fighter, Stamp had all of her pro MMA bouts in ONE Championship. So one of their homegrown fighters won the Grand Prix. Granted, had it gone the other way, it would have been the same way as well. But you had Stamp, who was at one time their kickboxing champion, and then their Muay Thai champion was now the MMA Grand Prix champion. So now the Grand Prix was technically over, sort of, except there was a big shadow looming over this entire tournament because Angela Lee was still the champion. She had been out for over 2 years at this point, but she was still the overall divisional champion. So now the extra fight, the extra bout, the boss fight after the boss fight has now been set, as Angela Lee will defend her Atomweight championship against Stamp Fairtex, the ONE Atomweight Grand Prix champion, This fight is going to go down as the main event of ONE X on March 26th. It's the 10th anniversary show for ONE Championship. This card was supposed to be back in December, and they put it off until March. So it's been a little over a year or 10 years for ONE. But this is their 10th anniversary card, and this bout's going to headline it. And it is an exciting bout, one I'm very looking forward to. I've been slowly watching tape, trying to work on a really good preview for this bout. Hopefully I'll have it out before the end of this month, because I want to get it out at least several weeks ahead of time. But I'm really looking forward to this one. I think this is going to be exciting, because it has a lot of questions. How will the ring rust affect Angela Lee? And has Stamp improved enough as an overall mixed martial artist to take on the long reigning champion in Lee? It's going to be very exciting. So that was the timeline for the ONE Atomweight Grand Prix. So now let's do a little bit of assessing. Not too big of an assessment, but we are going to assess this Grand Prix overall. So let's talk about pros and cons. So let's start with the pros. Let's start on a high note. So pros. Okay, first of all, tournaments are fun. And nobody can tell me that in spite of all the hiccups that this tournament experienced, the long, drawn-out process, fighters dropping out, fighters coming back in, more fighters dropping out, mixing up of the, what do you call them, alternate fighters. In spite of all of that, this was a fun tournament. The matchups ended up being really good, even with the fans voting on it. And I hate fan voting because they don't normally vote for the best matchups. But the fans did right in this one because we got some fun matchups in the semifinals with the fan voting. So this tournament, this Grand Prix was absolutely fun. And most MMA tournaments are fun. Very few of them end up being absolute just trash. And this one was far from that. This was fun tournament. This ended up being top-notch in spite of everything. Second pro, a #1 contender was crowned. And let's be honest here. Nobody can say that Stamp hasn't earned the right to be the #1 contender. She beat 3 fighters to win this Grand Prix championship. 3 fighters in the span of what? Basically 3 months. September to November, November to December. So she beat 3 fighters in a span of 3 months. Nobody can really deny that she is the rightful #1 contender at this point. Did she face everyone that, the fans wanted her to face? No, but that's the nature of tournaments. But the point was, this tournament was to crown a #1 contender, and that's what it did. And we got a rightful #1 contender. Another good thing out of this tournament was that the rankings were better defined to an extent. I still think that there are some problems with the rankings in ONE Championship. I mean, they have a fighter ranked below someone who they beat, because Ham won the fight against Zamboanga, and they still had Zamboanga ahead. But that doesn't matter because they're both below the #1 contender stamp. So the rankings were somewhat defined after this. For ONE Championship, it helped to distract from their long absentee champion, because when the tournament was started or was first announced, Angela had already been out for a year. And as soon as it concluded, she had been out for basically 2 years. So she's coming in after 2.5 years. But it was a good distraction because while the tournament Grand Prix was going on, no one was really talking about Angela Lee and going, well, where's their champion at? Where is their champion? She hasn't defended her title. So for the Grand Prix, it really worked out for ONE Championship business-wise, because it kept their fighters busy. It moved the division along, but biggest thing, marketing-wise, it distracted from their absentee champ. And then finally, good fights. These were good fights. None of them were boring. Now, granted, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What, 6 of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 fights out of 7 went to decision, but they were still fun in spite of that. We had a lot of really good back and forth action. None of the fights were just absolute shutouts. shellackings. The closest one to it would probably be Stamp versus Mesa Barba, but Mesa Barba still had her moments in that fight. Like, it wasn't just an absolute drubbing. So overall, the fights were good. For some cons, honestly, this took too long. And it wasn't all ONE Championship's fault. I mean, they had to delay the quarterfinals because of the COVID situation in Singapore, but it took too long. From the first announcement to the conclusion was 14 months. That's a year and 2 months. That's way too long. Now, I do remember that one CEO, Chatri Sityoton, said, you know, it took so long to start to name the participants because they were waiting on a final contract to get signed. But if it's taking that long, then find someone else. You know, you got to get this moving. You waited from October to February to announce the participants, another month to announce the matchups, which you should have already had decided by then, before then. And then how many months later for the first event to take place? Granted, that wasn't their fault. They were supposed to have a fight in May, and it got pushed back to September. But it just took entirely too long. Another con is that the unpredictable nature of mixed martial arts tournaments. You know, fighters dropped out. There's a lot of lineup changes, and the fighters dropped out, and too many lineup changes. I mean, a fighter dropped out because she lost a fight in Ritu Fogat. So she was out of the quarterfinals. They replaced her twice in the quarterfinals. They had 2 different replacements lined up for her before they finally brought her back in. And then you had fighters dropped out, so you had 2 alternates come in, and it just caused a lot of confusion. So, but that's the unpredictable nature of tournaments. That's always going to be a con about tournaments. It's both a pro and a con, because the unpredictable nature can make it fun, but it can also just take away a lot. Another con is that the length allowed their champ to sit out even longer. Whether that was for her benefit or not, we'll have to see. But it just allowed their absentee champion to sit out that much longer. And then finally, the lack of finishes in the fights. We had 1 finish out of 7 fights. It was in the finals. Thankfully, we got a finish in the finals, but just all the fights went to decision. Granted, finishes can't always happen. They can't. They can't. You're not always going to get a finish in these fights. But for a lot of these fighters who were known for finishes, they just went straight to decision. And it kind of killed. It was a slight buzzkill not having as many finishes in these fights. But most of those cons, I think the pros overall outweighed the cons. So there you have it, my overall review and assessment of the ONE Championship Atomweight Women's Grand Prix, or Women's Atomweight Grand Prix. Overall, I liked it. I had fun watching it. I thought it was very exciting. And we've got an exciting title bout coming up in Lee versus Stamp. We have an exciting rematch coming up because Ham and Zamboanga are going to be facing off against each other. And I'm sure the rest of these fighters will all be in action again soon. Actually, Ritu Monbo was already in action. She had already fought already, moved up a weight class and fought. And the rest of them, I'm sure, we'll be seeing back in action soon enough. So those are my thoughts. But what are yours? What are your overall assessment of the tournament? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, if you liked the video, I know it was a little long, but it had to be. So if you liked the video, please give it a like, share it as well. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to WMMA Scene Now, the best, most complete women's mixed martial arts dedicated platform on YouTube. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.